Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We all remember that crazy moment when suddenly, seemingly overnight, you couldn't buy toilet paper anywhere, computer chips completely vanished, and giant auto plants just stopped making cars. Well, today we're going to uncover how a century of business decisions meticulously built and then spectacularly broke the modern world. It's this wild story of incredible innovation, extreme corporate greed, and a global system that was stretched so incredibly thin that a single gust of wind brought the whole thing crashing down. Today, we're pulling apart the definitive investigation into how our modern global supply chain collapsed. And honestly, this isn't just a story about shipping containers getting stuck in ports. It's a deep dive into the very philosophies of how human beings manufacture things and how an absolute obsession with cutting costs fundamentally rewired global commerce. To make sense of this massive global collapse, we're going to follow a clear roadmap today. A plastic toy story, the factory to the world, the just-in-time revolution, Wall Street's lean obsession, and finally, the House of Cards falls. Section 1. A plastic toy story. Grounding the global crisis in a Mississippi startup. So we're starting by zooming in on this one super relatable microcosm. Meet Hagen Walker. He's a young entrepreneur running a startup called Glow out of an abandoned movie theater in Starkville, Mississippi, which, is exactly where you'd expect to find tens of thousands of light-up Sesame Street bath toys. His company had just landed the contract of a lifetime, a massive order for 42,392 light-up Elmo and Julia toys, just in time for the 2021 holidays. It was absolutely a make-or-break moment for them. But Walker quickly realized he had a huge manufacturing problem on his hands. See, he really wanted to make these toys in the United States to provide local jobs, but the American manufacturing base, it simply wasn't there anymore. Well, when Walker tried to source everything domestically, the quotes were just wild. One U.S. plant quoted him $18,000 just for the steel plates. That is literally 12 times higher than the price in China. And when he needed a complex pop-up box for the packaging, U.S. factories flat out told him it was too complex and advised him to just go get it made in China. So he was forced to turn to a factory in Ningbo, China. Why? Because Ningbo offered this abundant ecosystem where chemicals, plastics, and LED lights were all just readily available. Despite really wanting to keep jobs local, the harsh realities of lost U.S. manufacturing capacity and sky-high domestic costs completely forced his hand. Moving on to Section 2, the factory to the world. How manufacturing left home. It's kind of wild to think about, but over just a single century, we went from building everything in our own backyards to this deeply interconnected and honestly deeply fragile global web. We moved from Henry Ford making everything himself in the 1910s to Toyota streamlining parts in the 1950s to management consultants aggressively pushing lean production in the 1980s. But the absolute catalyst for the modern era was 2001, when China entered the World Trade Organization. That just opened the floodgates. Multinational corporations were thrilled, right? Because they were eager to access a billion-plus consumers and a massive, low-cost labor force where unions were banned. But how was this massive shift actually sold to the public? Well, President Bill Clinton and politicians at the time framed this push for cheaper labor not as a way for big brands to boost their profit margins, but as a righteous expansion of democratic ideals. The prevailing narrative was that economic freedom would inevitably lead to political freedom. The source text notes, however, that while this was pitched to the American public as a grand democratic transformation, the most immediate concrete result was a massive increase in corporate savings and a major shift in financial benefits straight toward international investors. Section 3. The Just-in-Time Revolution. The Philosophies of Making Things. Now, there's this really stark contrast between two legendary manufacturing philosophies that set all of this up. First, you have Henry Ford's vertical integration. Ford basically wanted to own the rubber trees, the steel mills, the railroads. He wanted to literally make everything himself. Then, on the flip side, you have Taiichi Ohno from Toyota, who pioneered just-in-time. Following the devastation of World War II, Japan really lacked space and resources. Ono was actually inspired by the American supermarket. You only stock the shelves with what you need, exactly when you need it, to eliminate all excess waste. It's a brilliant concept. Don't stockpile 10,000 parts, just bring the exact number of parts to the assembly line the very moment they are required. Actually, let's look back at Ford for just a second. Why was he so obsessed with making everything himself? Well, he was terrified of being, in his own words, dependent to the point where he could be pinched, right? If a single supplier withheld materials, his entire operation would halt. To prevent this, he built the massive Rouge plant in Michigan. We're talking about a gargantuan complex that took in raw iron ore at one end and literally spit out a finished Model T at the other. He wanted absolute resilience. He would rather tie up his capital in owning a glass factory than ever be caught short in a crisis. All right, Section 4, Wall Street's lean obsession, the hijacking of efficiency. And this brings us to a really crucial financial metric, return on assets, or ROA. You see, consultants from powerhouse firms like McKinsey effectively hijacked Toyota's just-in-time concept. Toyota created it to build better cars efficiently, sure, but Wall Street realized that if you strip away all your safety inventory, all those extra backup parts sitting in a warehouse, you suddenly have fewer assets on your books. And here is the trick. Through simple division, when you lower your assets, your return on assets ratio skyrockets. This looks absolutely amazing to investors and directly boosts the stock price. So the goal completely shifted from making great products reliably to making the balance sheet look as attractive as possible for the next quarter. This extreme corporate mindset is perfectly summed up by Apple CEO Tim Cook, who once said, "Inventory is fundamentally evil." I mean, think about how radical that statement is. Treating backup supplies, parts, and safety nets not as vital insurance for a rainy day, but as a direct, evil threat to corporate profits. They wanted to manage inventory like dairy. If it sits around, it spoils. But the problem is, when a global crisis hits, zero inventory means zero ability to keep manufacturing. The real-world consequence of this ideology: absolute absurdity. Take a company in Minnesota called Onin. They made massive $250,000 industrial generators. Consultants, who were sometimes referred to internally as the Lean Taliban for their fanatical devotion to cutting inventory, forced the factory to stop stocking basic parts. The results? The factory was literally paralyzing shipments of huge, highly profitable six-figure generators simply because they were waiting on a missing $5 piece of sheet metal. They were spending more money on expedited air freight to fix their self-imposed delays than they were ever saving by not stocking at cheap brackets. So, what did these corporations actually do with all the cash they saved by firing workers and emptying their warehouses? $6 trillion. The source data shows that instead of investing in resilience, instead of stockpiling emergency parts or expanding domestic factory capacity, American companies spent $6 trillion buying back their own stock in the decade before the pandemic. Stock buybacks inflate the share price, enriching executives and shareholders, while leaving the actual physical supply chain completely hollowed out and incredibly exposed. Section 5. The House of Cards falls. The pandemic shock. So, when COVID-19 hit, corporate leaders made an epic miscalculation. They basically assumed a global pandemic meant a global depression. So step 1, panic sets in, and major brands wildly canceled their factory orders, expecting absolutely no one to buy anything. Ocean carriers literally idled their massive ships. But then, step 2 happened. Lockdown consumers didn't stop spending. They just stopped buying plane tickets and started buying massive amounts of physical goods. Office chairs, webcams, TVs, home gym equipment, you name it. Step 3, this massive, completely unexpected surge in demand hit a system that had deliberately kept zero slack. Factories in China were overwhelmed, shipping containers vanished, and the entire incredibly tight system simply jammed up. And you know, this wasn't just about your new couch being delayed by 3 months. The lack of backup inventory cost jobs, it halted global manufacturing, and it literally threatened lives. Ford had to halt entire production lines because they couldn't get a tiny computer chip from Taiwan, a single supplier they relied on for up to 90% of their chips. In San Diego, a man named Joseph Norwood couldn't get a life-saving sleep apnea ventilator. The manufacturer, ResMed, couldn't build the ventilators because they couldn't get the computer chips, because the chip makers were prioritizing massive contracts with smartphone companies instead. When you optimize entirely for stock prices, medical devices get starved out by consumer electronics. Zooming back to our microcosm, Hagen Walker and his startup in Mississippi. His massive order of over 42,000 Sesame Street toys was suddenly trapped. His factory in Ningbo couldn't get enough thermoplastic. Why? Because the Chinese government was rationing plastic for medical gear, and the cost of everything else was skyrocketing. Walker was advised to order everything he possibly could immediately because the entire global infrastructure, from raw materials to shipping containers, was breaking down. This macro-level corporate obsession with lean operations directly crippled a small American business's ability to secure the most basic materials. As we wrap up this explainer, we're basically left staring at a deeply fragile system. We spent a century optimizing for cost and shareholder value, completely forgetting Henry Ford's warning about being dependent to the point where we could be pinched. We traded resilience for short-term profits. So you really have to ask yourself, now that the house of cards has fallen once,
Have we actually learned to prepare for the next storm? Or will the memory fade and the drive for the bottom line lead us right back to the edge? Thank you so much for joining me, and keep asking the big questions.